philosophy on learning openings is that it's all about learning the ideas. That's mainly for advanced players that already understand the ideas, understand the middle game themes and plans. For anyone learning a new opening, I think that's the number one thing to start with. That's what we're going to start with today, is understanding some of like the middle game plans, structures, and themes. Maybe that'll be the first point I'll make. If you want to learn the King's Indian or any opening really, one of the best things you can do is to choose a player or a number of players that you really look up to that have played some incredible games in this opening, and then play through their games and analyze them, try to learn from them. So Nakamura, of course, he's one of the great King's Indian players of all time. Personally, I've studied a bunch of his games. Many King's Indian players have as well. Other players that people know are like Kasparov, Fischer. These are great King's Indian fanatics. I'm a big fan of Grandmaster Ilya Smirin as well from Israel. He's an incredible King's Indian player. And there's also a lot of classic players too. Geller, Gligorich, Petrosian, Spassky. All these guys essentially played the King's Indian at some point and absolutely.
I love that you know your chess from the 50s and 60s. That's really nice.
Are you a fan as well?
Oh yeah, big fan. The way I started chess content was literally by posting every single chess game from the 1953 Zurich.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, amazing tournament. Lots of great King's Indian games in that tournament. So that's kind of like the first point. To learn any opening, right? You gotta study players, you gotta look at their middle games, and then you can pick up middle game ideas. And then for most players, it won't really matter what the opening moves were, what the move order was. At some point, you're gonna get a King's Indian structure. You're gonna get a position where the center is closed. You got this structure. White's push d5. And now it's up to black to attack on the king side, and it's up to white to push on the queen side. Let's call this one fundamental structure that every King's Indian player should know. There's obviously a lot of thematic ideas here, black is pushing on the king side, running the g pawn, eventually running the h pawn as well, playing for this pawn storm. Black is just giving up on the queen side. They're going all in on the king side. So if you're the type of player that's doesn't love to take huge risks, wants to keep the position under control, everything is solid, it's the King's Indian is the worst opening for you. You absolutely have to get into these chaotic positions and you have to be willing to play chaotically. Naka's decision here, d takes c5, I think is very counterintuitive. It looks like he's kind of opening up the queen side. But of course, what he understood is that if he didn't play this move, Gelfand, his opponent here, was gonna play b6 anyway, and things were gonna get ripped apart. So by taking this one, he's actually opening up some dark squares for the future. There's a lot of positions where black's bishop comes back to f8, and then he fights for the dark squares and he's able to use this diagonal. But of course in this game, you see this bishop f8 move, and then of course he ends up breaking through on the king side with these insane tactics. Most of us can't play like Nakamura, right? It's gonna be hard to find these tactical ideas and all these sacrifices. It's like a steam engine. It's it just keeps going. Everything is getting thrown at the white king side. That's how you play the King's Indian. You just gotta keep going with the attack. If you think it's not gonna succeed, if you think it's gonna sputter out, then you'll second guess everything and it won't be good. So that's really the big point here. You have to be willing to go all in when you're playing these positions. Some specific details here, this rook f7 maneuver is quite famous. This one was invented by the great Gligorich. The idea of transferring the bishop back to f8, where it helps defend against white's queenside pressure. It also allows the rook to transfer to the g file, where it's very, very well placed. This is of course one structure where you get this closed position. Obviously in the King's Indian, you can get all kinds of different structures. So I just want to talk a little bit about what else can kind of happen. The big decision that white has to make is how much space they want to have. Do they want to push d5 and try to take everything, which is very risky? Do they want to go d takes e5 and go for this kind of exchange structure where they have less space, but the position's a little bit more open? So in the exchange structures, it's white is a lot less likely to get mated on the king side because the center is open and black simply can't expose themselves that much. When you have the exchange structure, whether white goes for the endgame here or not, when I'm really talking about this structure, e4, c4 against this e5 pawn, absolute most critical thing that King's Indian players need to remember here is that this structure is actually long-term good for black because you still have the option to put the pawn on c6. You restrict the knight on c3, you don't let white use these squares on d5 and b5, but on the flip side, in the long run, black is always going to have this d4 square. Generally, the plan is to try to get this knight from b8 to d4. Sometimes you can skip a b, go knight c6, knight d4 directly. If white were to castle here, I think knight c6 is an excellent move. You can just launch it for the d4 square. A lot of times you got to play c6 first, control the square, and then this knight has to kind of maneuver around. Knight d7, knight c5, knight e6, knight d4. Or knight d7, knight f8, knight e6, knight d4. Or this knight goes knight h5, knight f4, knight e6, knight d4. Right, which route you take, okay, depends on what your opponent does. You have to be a chess player. You have to think about the position. You have to calculate, figure out how to execute your plan. But just understanding the plan, it's like you're just trying to establish the knight on d4. That's the key thing about this one. Any questions on that before I keep going?
You're having a lot of space here to talk, but yeah, very interesting so far. Not many questions. Oh, my chat is also recommending. Is there ever a time where we play knight a6? Thanks. Oh, well, that something like this, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's one tip I just want to throw out. A lot of players, when they first pick up the King's Indian, I don't know where exactly it comes from, but a lot of players, they just default to playing knight bd7 in like every position. I often see it from my students. It's like, oh, they're just playing knight d7. They just think the knight belongs there and then they put it there. But yeah, I really want to specify this, especially as you get stronger. You'll often have a choice with the knight, whether you're developing it to d7, c6, or a6. All these squares have their merits. Of course, the knight on d7, it blocks the light squared bishop, but also gets in the way of the queen. Sometimes the queen's like not defending the d-pawn, which ends up important in some Benoni type of structures. So one of the biggest decisions that black has to make in this position is how they're going to develop the knight. Not just this position, but many of white's lines, whether they're playing like Samish variation, h3 variation, all kinds of different lines that white can throw. And in all of them, black often has a choice of what to do with the knight. It's rarely just only one option is correct. You got to go knight c6, you got to go knight a6. So knight on a6, it looks a little funky, but it still aims to go for the c5 square. And typically the follow-up with this one is that you play e5 here, and then you fight for the c5 square so that your knight can be really strong. Last thing I'll say, and then I'd be happy to take any questions. I know this is a super quick lesson, but last thing, like I mentioned, white has a bunch of options, right? They can develop and castle kingside, they can castle queenside, they can play London system, for example, right? They don't have to take all this space with e4, d4, c4. Many different options for white. And for black, you really have to kind of choose very carefully what kind of setup you want to do. So a good rule of thumb I have, because often black is choosing between like e5 and c5, whether you play kind of more classical with e5 or kind of Benoni style with c5, what I would say is this: if you think your opponent is castling queenside, meaning they play, let's say, the Samish variation with f3, this usually indicates they want to go queenside. They want to play bishop e3, queen d2, castle queenside, or h3. It also means that they're probably going to want to castle queenside and look to attack on the king side. Then I would skew more towards not blocking the bishop on g7. That's another thing that players do. They'll play e5 in almost any kind of line, any kind of position, trying to get this structure. But then this kingside attack doesn't really work as well if white's going to castle queenside. So that's my last suggestion. It's like, try to be mindful of what your opponent is doing. If they want to go queenside out of the opening, then maybe keep the e-pawn flexible, look to hit them with c5, especially if they castle way too early. This bishop is then open on this diagonal. It becomes an irresistible attack from black. White just can't survive with the strong bishop on. It just becomes like a super dragon from black's point of view. Okay, let me sum it up. 3 things. In the Martel Plata kind of classic positions with the board split into 2, you got to go all in on the king side. You got to try to defend the queen side a little bit, but really it's about kind of keeping white's play at bay while throwing everything on the king side. If you get some kind of exchange structure with d takes e5, then it's all about the d4 square. And black's big trump is that they can play c6 in these positions and really heavily restrict and play against knight on c3. And lastly, if your opponent is playing very aggressive line where they're castling queenside, then don't just default to this e5 break all the time. Look to throw in c5, which is especially effective against the Samish, for instance. Pretty much all lines where white is castling queenside, you want to play for that queenside counterplay. So that means playing the c5 break, maybe playing a b5 like Benko style. That's one of the things I love about the King's Indian, by the way. You have all these different ideas. You can play like a Benko structure, Benoni structure, all these different ideas you can pull from different openings that end up showing themselves in your games. I think people are ready now. Go out, go start playing, study some Nakamura games, some Radjabov games, and okay, 3-4 months, everyone listening will be a brilliant King's Indian player.
Thank you so much for that opening summary. Very nice portrayal of ideas. I really appreciated it. You mentioned Mar del Plata like structure.
Yeah, the main line here.
Yeah, with D5. Like this? Why did you say Mar del Plata? It was invented in that tournament?
Yeah, actually, it's a very cool story. It comes from the Mar del Plata Interzonal, which I think was also 1953, before the Zurich 1953 famous tournament. And this is known as like the Mar del Plata variation. I think officially they call this one with like knight e1 Mar del Plata, because there's other lines like b4, it's like the bayonet attack and stuff. So officially it's kind of like this one after knight e1. But basically the story, it's a very cool story. Gligorich was playing as black against Najdorf, who's playing white. And at the time, this stuff was very, very popular. People didn't really believe in the King's Indian, so it was fresh. And so they really liked the setup with knight e1, bishop e3, and so on. And Gligorich in that game pretty much over the board invents like a lot of these very typical maneuvers, like rook f7, bishop f8. He writes about this in his book. He wrote a very nice book about the King's Indian. And he's
his autobiography? My Best Games, right?
Not his best games, but he wrote a book specifically about the King's Indian.
Oh, okay. I don't have that one. Okay.
It's small, but it's really cool. Yeah, he's such a humble guy. He's like, I never wanted to take credit for anything, but I feel like I kind of deserve credit for this one, because he literally he invents this rook f7, bishop f8 maneuver just like over the board. It has this like conception, which is now just like just gold standard.
Common play right now.
King's Indian players. He also comes up with this like really cool knight h8 maneuver, where the knight transfers to f7 and g5, which has also since become thematic. So he crushes Najdorf in this game, and then a couple months later, Najdorf then uses the same setup as black to crush Taimanov in the famous Zurich 1953 tournament. That game ends up winning, I think, one of the Brilliancy Prizes. And then everyone's like, oh, such a genius game. But Najdorf literally copied the setup from Gligorich. He just learned a couple months ago.
Gligorich played against him.
Exactly. Then he's like, wow, great opening, boss. Plays it as black, wins, a couple of their games too.
Wow, crazy. Thank you so much for the added story. There you go.